Content warning. Episodes of Gray Matter may contain themes and depictions of extreme mental illness, traumatic bodily harm, and death. If you aren't in the right headspace to engage with those depictions right now, maybe this episode should wait for another time. Otherwise, proceed with caution.
Hey, welcome back to Gray Matter Video. Been waiting for you to come back in here. I thought you might have been gone forever after that last tape. Not that I blame you, but I pulled a little something out of the archives for you this time around. This one's a classic. Pretty conventional, at least for us, just a fun little story about a mystery monster that might not be there at all. It's called The Damned Thing. I think you'll like it. It's a solid 4-quadrant hit with just a little bit of weird sprinkled on top.
The Damned Thing, written and directed by Jonathan Inbody, based on the short story of the same name by Ambrose Bierce.
My name is Ann Harper, and I'm a crisis counselor. On November 14th, I was called out into a heavy rainstorm to talk to a man in the middle of a standoff with the police at his family farm. I swear to God, this is exactly what happened. As I drove up the poorly maintained mountain road towards the Morgan family farm, I tried to run through everything I remembered from the file in my head. The Morgans were a family of 4. The mother, Henrietta, had died a few years ago. The adult daughter, Carrie, was estranged. The 19-year-old son, Trevor, who still lived at home with his father, had been mauled to death by a wild animal while hunting on the mountain. His father, Hugh, had seen it happen. That was only 3 months ago, and in the time since, Hugh had begun to act erratically. His daughter had tried desperately to get her father to sell the farm and move down from the mountain, but Hugh wouldn't have it. He began to dip into his retirement fund, first for bear traps, then motion sensor lights, then infrared cameras. According to Carrie, who I spoke briefly to on the phone, he also began stockpiling guns and ammunition. Finally, she had given up on him and abandoned him to lonely grief for the sake of carrying on with her own life. She was grieving too, but her way was healthier. To Hugh, a product of rural America, to ask for help was to show weakness, and he had no intention of appearing weak. With that said, it's easy to understand why Carrie was shocked to get a phone call from her father at 3 a.m. on the night of November 13th. He was crying, sobbing, and possibly drunk, but through his slurred speech, she had been able to understand what it was he was trying to say. "I caught it," he had told her. "I caught the damned thing." There was no history of mental illness in the Morgan family line, at least none that had been diagnosed or openly discussed. But Carrie explained to me that her father had recently become obsessed with a single, all-consuming delusion. He was convinced, against all reason and without any evidence to show, that his son had been killed by an invisible monster. I turned off the road and onto the muddy driveway, switching my windshield wipers to their highest setting as the heavy rain poured down. Up ahead, I saw a pair of police cars parked near a small tool shed, their flashing lights casting red and blue streaks across the nearby house and barn. The barn door appeared to have been reinforced with steel, and now sat with metal beams stretched across it as if to keep something from getting out. On the covered porch of the small farmhouse stood Hugh Morgan. His hair was gray and his face was weathered, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that gave me pause as he turned to look at my approaching car. In his hand, he was holding a shotgun. I pulled up next to the tool shed, where 2 policemen stood huddled underneath a narrow overhang. One of them held a small megaphone, and the other had his hand resting on his holster. Next to them stood a man in an ill-fitting button-down shirt and a shabby tie. That, I assumed, was the detective in charge. I lowered my car window, leaning back to avoid getting splashed on, then raised my voice to speak over the pounding rain. I'm looking for Latimer?
In the car!
What?
Can we talk in your car?
Thank you. It's a lot easier to talk in here than out there. You must be Dr. Harper?
I'm not a doctor, but yes.
Psychologist, whatever.
Crisis counselor.
What's that mean?
It means I show up when people are at a breaking point, and I try to keep them in one piece.
Well, good luck with this one. The guy's nuts.
No, he isn't. If anything, he's suffering from a stress-induced delusion. Calling him crazy won't change that. Now tell me what's happening here. I know the basics. I need the details.
Guy's daughter called the station, wanted us to swing by and do a welfare check. She said he was depressed, delusional, had guns in the house. Second he saw a uniformed officer at his door, he started waving that pump action around.
And that's when you got called in?
They wanted somebody who wasn't a traffic cop to keep an eye on things.
When was that?
A couple of hours ago. Tried talking to the guy with the megaphone, but he doesn't want to talk to a cop. Kept saying we're gonna open the barn, let it out, and he'd rather shoot us than let that happen.
It? You mean his monster?
Sure, if you want to call it that. Of course, none of us have seen anything moving around in there, and we can't hear anything over the rain, but he really doesn't want anyone getting inside.
I spoke to his daughter on the way over. She said after her brother died, Hugh started to have some clarity issues.
They had me pull the file on the Sun to read on the way over here. Some of those pictures, no wonder he's fucked up. The mountain lion tore the kid to pieces.
Hugh doesn't believe it was a mountain lion. Whatever it was, or whatever he thought it was, that's what he thinks he's got locked in that barn. And he thinks you're trying to let it out. If you caught the thing that killed your son, wouldn't you wave a gun around to keep people away from it?
I guess. All I know is I want to go home, and I don't want to get shot today. If you think you can make that happen, get this guy to back down and come into town to see a doctor, and I'll back you up as much as I can. But if he so much as points that gun at you...
He's not gonna hurt me, Latimer. I'm on his side. He wished me luck, and we got out of the car. I put my hands up to show the gray-haired man on the porch that I wasn't armed, then began to walk slowly towards him. He raised his gun, and out of the corner of my eye I saw Latimer bristle. I waved him off, then turned back to Hugh. Mr. Morgan, I'm Ann Harper. I'm here to help.
You got a gun, Ann?
No, sir. Can I come over there so that we can talk? I'm getting rained on. Hugh thought it over, then reluctantly nodded and lowered his shotgun. I walked over and stepped up onto the porch, shaking some rain off of my jacket as I shivered. It's nice to meet you, Hugh.
I don't need you to lie.
I'm not. I'm being polite.
Well, I don't need that either.
What do you need, Hugh?
I need you to believe me.
About what?
You know.
I talked to Carrie on my way over here. She's worried about you.
I never should have called.
So why did you?
She needed to know. I needed her to know.
That you caught it? That Trevor's death wasn't for nothing?
Don't do that.
What?
Act like you believe me.
I'm not here to believe or to not believe. I'm here to make sure you're okay and to resolve this situation without violence. I know Detective Latimer and the other officers are making you nervous, but you're making them nervous too, the way you're swinging that gun around.
They want to let it out.
They don't, Hugh. They just came here because Carrie asked them to check on you.
I don't need checking on.
You two hadn't spoken for weeks, and then you called her drunk and crying in the middle of the night. Can you see why she'd be concerned?
I suppose.
And can you see why the police reacted the way they did when you came to the door with your shotgun?
I guess.
Now, if you'll come with us into town, talk to a doctor, maybe give your guns to a friend for safekeeping, we're all gonna get off your land and you can go on with your life.
I can't leave. The second I'm gone, your Detective Latimer's gonna open the barn, if only because he's curious. He can't let that thing out. It's wily. Took me months to catch it. If it gets away now, it'll be gone for good. It'll find a new hunting ground. Eat someone else's son.
What is it?
I saw it before Trevor died. Or at least signs of it. A flock of birds all flying away at once. Fallen branches breaking underneath an invisible shape. I even saw the outline of it once at night, slinking around on top of the hill, blocking out the stars behind it. Told Trevor. He saw it too, stalking him while he hunted rabbits in the woods. Couldn't even see the damn thing, that's what he said. The name stuck.
And this thing, it's invisible?
Only to us. Other animals, they can feel it, pick up its scent, or hear it skulking around in the underbrush. That's why it killed Trevor's dog. Tore it to pieces just so we couldn't track it.
That sounds like a mountain lion, Hugh.
Well, it isn't. Maybe something similar. Cat-like, but it's bigger. Bigger than a grizzly, but quiet as a deer. Now, I know how all that sounds, but if I was crazy, why would Trevor help me hunt it?
Have you ever heard the term folie à deux? It's when two people share the same false belief.
You mean delusion?
It's not too much to think that Trevor would trust your judgment, even without evidence. He probably had a lot of respect for you.
And when he saw it on his own?
It could just be the power of suggestion. People say they see ghosts all the time, and I'm sure most of them believe it, but I don't think that means it's true.
Yeah, but those people are crazy.
They don't think so. They're just confused, you know?
Well, I'm not.
Hugh, I'm not trying to make you feel stupid. I'm really not. But which is more likely? That a mountain lion lives up here in the hills, or that you found a monster that can turn invisible?
It's not a monster. It's an animal. A smart animal, and a tough son of a bitch, but an animal. And I don't think it turns anything. I think it's just a color that we can't see, like infrared, but more than that. It sets off motion sensors, but it doesn't show up on heat sensors. It leaves footprints, but it doesn't set off bear traps. Maybe it's a defense mechanism or something, like survival of the fittest.
And it was the only animal to evolve that way? To be a color no one can see?
I don't know if it's the only one. Could be plenty of them all over and we'd never know.
You understand why it's hard for me to believe you, don't you?
Seeing might be believing, Miss Harper. But just because you can't see something doesn't mean it don't exist.
Do you have any proof?
I've got better. I've got the damned thing itself. That's why I can't let you unlock that barn.
I don't want to unlock the barn. No one does. We just want you to get help.
Bring a doctor out here. Better yet, bring a veterinarian. Someone who can document the thing, observe and measure it in the way you people will respect. Once it's proven, once you know I'm not crazy, y'all can leave.
What do you want us to do until then? Just wait?
If you have to.
I could tell from the look on his face that I wasn't getting anywhere. He was convincing, I'd give him that, with none of the telltale signs of a nervous breakdown other than paranoia. But he was walking on the edge of a knife, and I don't think he realized how easy it would be to fall. His belief in the damned thing presented as a singular mania, the long percolated conviction that justified all of his loss. Through the lens of delusion, his son's death hadn't been a tragedy, but instead the latest aggression in a war of man and mythical beast. I stepped down off the porch and started across the muddy driveway towards Latimer and his men, still huddled underneath the overhanging side of the tool shed.
What did he have to say?
He wants more people out here. A veterinarian, someone who can prove the thing in the barn exists.
You're not suggesting we give it to him, are you?
I don't know if there's another way to get him to hand over the gun.
This is ridiculous.
Not to him. Latimer took out his gun and tossed it down into the mud, then started walking towards the barn as the rain finally began to slow. On the porch, Hugh tightened his grip on the shotgun.
Latimer, what are you doing?
I'm opening the barn.
You can't. He's going to...
Don't you take another goddamn step!
There's nothing in there, Mr. Morgan. I'm gonna show you.
Latimer, don't antagonize him.
I tossed my gun away. You gonna shoot an unarmed man?
If I have to.
Hugh, please. He doesn't know what he's doing. Don't hurt him.
He'll kill us all if he lets that thing out.
My fellow officers have guns, Mr. Morgan. There's a monster in there. They'll kill it.
Latimer stepped up to the barn door and strained to lift up one of the metal beams that had been laid across it. He pulled it out of place, his shoulders heaving with the strain. then dropped it off to the side of the barn and turned back to remove the other one. Latimer stumbled forward, clutching a hand to the gunshot wound on the back of his thigh. His other hand gripped the remaining beam, trying to steady himself, and as he collapsed, the beam slid out of place and splashed to the ground. One of the cops behind me shoved me down into the mud, and I heard both of them draw their weapons. Hugh fell back and smacked his head against the side of his house, then slid down to the porch. From where I was laying in the mud, I could see 2 gunshot wounds in his chest. He stared at the barn in vacant horror, and I followed his gaze just in time to see the door slowly swing open. There was nothing inside. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Latimer, rolling over in the mud, turned to look at Hugh.
I told you, you crazy fuck.
I thought it was in there. I swear I caught it. It was there.
I sighed and got back to my feet, wiping off the front of my pants as I looked over at Latimer. A strange shape rose up behind him. It was cat-like, and it was bigger than a grizzly, but that wasn't what stood out to me. I could only see its outline, silhouetted by the falling rain as it took a massive step out of the barn. Its huge feline head swung back and forth, taking all of us in with feral calculation. Then the rain stopped, and it disappeared from view.
Latimer, we have to go! Now!
What?
A huge paw print appeared in the mud on one side of Latimer's body, then another on the other side. He turned and looked at them, then back at me as if silently wondering if I saw it too. His head suddenly caved in and splattered as unseen jaws clamped down onto it. The damned thing flung its transparent head back, streaked with splatters of the detective's blood, skull, and brain, then shook his thrashing body back and forth in the air, spraying hot jets of arterial blood down into the mud. On the porch, Hugh let out a string of curse words as he struggled to raise his shotgun. Behind me, the other policemen opened fire, blasting at the open air around where Latimer's mutilated corpse was dangling. Suddenly, the limp body dropped like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The invisible shape was on the move. Massive footsteps thundered away through the mud, and after only a second, it loped around the side of the barn and disappeared.
It ain't done. You gotta get out of here.
The muddy footsteps came charging around the other side of the barn, turning in a sharp circle towards the 3 of us standing at the tool shed. I broke right and dove for the porch as the shape slammed into one of the cops, and I crawled through the mud towards the house as a flurry of gunshots broke out behind me. After a second, they were replaced with screams, then gurgles, and finally silence. I turned my head slowly, trying to keep from making any sudden moves as the mud squelched underneath me. I could see one of the cops lying in 2 bloody pieces, his arms twisted and broken and his legs twitching with the last spark of mechanical life. But where was the other? A huge mud-covered paw came down beside me and I gasped, then clamped my hand over my mouth to keep silent. I could see most of the paw now, with caked mud covering the huge crescent claws and running up a powerful leg. I knew that at the top of the phantom limb was the heaving bulk of the damned thing, and I quickly scanned back and forth as I tried to find where the head might be. Then I saw it, covered in blood and viscera, making it just as visible as the bizarre creature's powerful legs. I saw huge, gnashing fangs, with clouds of red breath drifting up from the sides of a gaping maw as blood trickled down a whiskered chin. I could hear the thing breathing now, almost growling, and chewing up what I suspected were the last remains of the second cop. The creature bellowed and violently coughed, then spat a bloody, half-chewed arm down into the mud beside me. I tried not to think about the ring on one of the fingers. Could it see me? Would it hear me if I moved? The damned thing lowered its huge head and sniffed at my back with its stubby snout. I heard blood patter down from the sides of its open mouth and onto my jacket, and as I felt the puddles of warm liquid begin to pool, it took everything in me to keep from screaming. I I looked up at the sound of the shotgun and saw Hugh Morgan. He was leaning on the porch railing for support, with patches of dark red blood still spreading on his flannel shirt. He weakly pumped the shotgun, wedging it in the crook of his injured arm to get leverage, then lowered the barrel back down and pointed it at his son's killer.
Die, you bastard.
The side of the damned thing's face burst open like a smashed pumpkin, scattering splashes of bright blue blood and shattered fangs into the mud. The creature shrieked and stumbled backwards, swaying back and forth as Hugh pumped the shotgun again. Patches of the beast's hide began to ripple into visibility, exposing fine, prismatic hairs that shined in a kaleidoscope of neon colors as they rose in feral shock. So it could change. The damned thing shrieked again and lashed out to one side, smashing through the porch with a half-invisible tail and knocking Hugh back against the wall. Then it ran back past the barn and into the woods, bellowing in pain as it fled. Flickers of rainbow light trailed after it, reflecting off of the wet ground and casting a strange borealis onto the narrow trees. As it went, the impossible colors faded, leaving only the dull browns, greens, and grays of the sparse mountainside. I slowly got to my feet and stumbled up onto the porch, struggling to keep my legs from shaking from the adrenaline. Hugh smiled weakly and lifted up a bloody hand to wave as I approached. His weathered face was pale, and his hands were clammy as I took them into mine. "Just stay awake. I'm going to call for help."
I think I'm a little past that, Miss Harper.
"You can't die here, Hugh. No one's going to believe me if you do."
They wouldn't anyway. Folly you do, remember? 2 witnesses can be ignored as easily as 1.
You were right. I'm sorry I didn't believe you.
Too late now anyway.
Do you think it'll come back?
With any luck, it's just trying to find a quiet spot to die. I got it pretty good. Maybe it'll bleed out. Otherwise, it's liable to just hide out a while, lick its wounds. You should probably get out of here. Call someone when you're far enough away.
What the hell am I going to tell them?
You want my advice? Pretend you never saw it. Tell them you got here after everything happened. Go and live your life. And don't read any obituaries.
But what if it's still out there? What if it starts killing again?
If you talk to Carrie, would you tell her I said I'm sorry?
Yeah, I can do that. By the time the EMTs got there, Hugh Morgan was dead, alongside 3 policemen. The barn was open, with muddy paw prints that led in a path from one shredded corpse to the next. But even as I looked at the horrific scene, I knew what the report would say. Mountain lion, grizzly bear. Maybe it had been, and maybe I just imagined the damn thing that ate Detective Latimer and killed Hugh Morgan. It wasn't like anyone would believe me, anyway. But as I sat in the back of an ambulance, not knowing what to say or how to say it, my eyes fell on my discarded jacket. On the back, in a few half-dried patches, were splatters of blue blood.
The Damned Thing was written and directed by Jonathan Inbody and based on the short story of the same name by Ambrose Bierce. It was edited by Jeffrey Lavin, with music composed and performed by Samantha Hunt. Anne Harper, the narrator, was played by Samantha Hunt. Quinn played Hugh Morgan, and Jonathan Inbody played Detective Latimer. Gray Matter is a word search media production. Any similarities to real people, places, or things is purely coincidental. Be kind. Rewind.